All right, so you're prepping for the UPSC, right? And international relations is your thing.
Mhm.
Well, today we're going deep on a thinker you can't really avoid, especially in IR Karl Marx.
Yeah, Marx. But look, we're not going to bog you down with dense theory, okay?
Oh, me.
This is more like your cheat sheet, to
Exactly.
understanding Marx's impact on global politics, stuff you can actually use in your UPSC IR paper.
Okay, so even if I'm not planning on joining, like, the Communist Party or something,
Exactly.
why should I care about Marx?
Because, well, even if you don't agree with everything he said, you got to understand this. His theories on power, on economics, on history, they're essential, really.
They're essential for...
There's like a decoder ring for understanding how nations interact, on the world stage.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is relevant for, like, an aspiring diplomat or someone working in foreign policy.
Totally. Think about it.
Yeah.
Major global events, right? The Cold War, the rise of communist states, even the debates we're having right now about economic inequality. I mean, they all have roots in Marxist thought.
It's like he's everywhere, even if we don't realize it.
Plus, understanding different schools of thought within IR, like Marxism. I mean, it's straight from your UPSC syllabus.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's like knowing the rules of the game, even if you're playing a different position.
Exactly.
Got it. But, okay, I have to ask this.
Sure.
I can always hear people talking about, a young Marx and an old Marx. Was there, like, a massive shift in his thinking? I mean, did he totally change his mind at some point?
It's more nuanced than like a complete 180.
Okay, that's good.
More like a sharpening of focus over time, right?
Okay.
So some scholars, they say the young Marx, he was really concerned with humanistic stuff, like alienation. The idea that under capitalism, people kind of become disconnected from their work, from each other, from themselves even.
Oh, I get that. Like, imagine being a diplomat who has to represent policies you completely disagree with.
Exactly. That feeling, right?
Yeah, it's like a disconnect.
That disconnect, yeah, that's
Yeah.
similar to what Marx is talking about with alienation.
Okay, so it's not so much about a midlife crisis as it is about, like, refining his ideas over time.
Right.
So what about the old Marx? What was his focus?
He became more focused on the nuts and bolts of capitalism, like how it works, how it ticks, its internal contradictions,
Okay.
and how it would eventually, lead to its own downfall.
Downfall, huh? Well, we'll have to see about that. But even those early ideas about alienation, I mean, they're still pretty relevant in international relations, aren't they?
Oh, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
think about how economic disparities, right? Between nations, it can create resentment, conflict.
Oh, for sure.
You could argue that, like, even forms of international terrorism, they stem from a sense of alienation. Alienation fueled by global economic inequalities.
Yeah, wow. That's a pretty powerful example. So it's not just enough to memorize these theories.
Yeah.
You've really got to understand how they connect to, like, the real world, to current events.
Speaking of connecting things, we can't really talk about Marx without mentioning Friedrich Engels, right?
No, absolutely not.
It's like they were the dynamic duo of socialist theory.
Lenin and McCartney of socialism, right?
Exactly.
And it gets really interesting because, some of Marx's most famous works, like the Communist Manifesto,
Oh, yeah, that one.
co-authored with Engels.
Wow. So it's like trying to figure out, like, who wrote which Beatles song.
Exactly. But for the UPSC, it's actually worth being aware of the Engels factor.
Okay.
Especially when you're discussing things like the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
It shows you understand the nuances, the complexities.
Right. It's like a deeper level of analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what impresses, those examiners. They want to see that you can think critically. Okay, so besides having a famous writing partner, what else shaped Marx's ideas? What else was going on in the world that kind of led him to these conclusions?
Well, to really get Marx, I think you got to understand the intellectual climate that he was working in. So his theories, right, they emerged from this huge shift in thinking in like the late 17th century.
Okay, so this is before Marx even came along.
Yeah, way before. So before this time, poverty, disparities, they were seen as just part of the natural order, like the weather or something. You couldn't change it.
It's just the way things were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then thinkers started to argue that these problems were man-made.
Okay.
And more importantly, solvable.
So it's like the Enlightenment, right, where people started challenging these old assumptions.
Exactly. The Enlightenment was huge.
Yeah.
And Marx, he took this idea and ran with it.
Okay.
He went further, arguing that inequality wasn't just a problem to fix, it was built into the very DNA of capitalism.
So he wasn't interested in just tweaking the system. He wanted to completely overhaul it.
Dismantle it. Wow. And that's why, understanding intellectual history is so important, particularly for the UPSC. It's like connecting the dots, between different thinkers, different movements.
Yeah, you can see how ideas build on each other.
Exactly, how they evolve. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. So this evolution of ideas, this is what led to the rise of socialism, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
As a response to what Marx saw as liberalism's failures to address social inequality.
Right.
But wait a minute, I'm remembering something.
Yeah.
Wasn't Marx actually pretty critical of other socialists of his time? I vaguely remember something about utopian socialists. Like that was a bad word in Marxist circles, right?
Oh, he definitely wasn't shy about critiquing them, that's for sure. He called them utopians because he thought they were too focused on, these dreamy ideals without a concrete plan for how to achieve them.
So it's like they had the vision, but not the blueprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Marx saw himself as offering a more scientific approach to socialism, grounded in a really rigorous analysis of capitalism. He wasn't just complaining about the problem, he was trying to diagnose it, figure out how it worked and how it could be changed.
So he was bringing, the blueprints to the table,
Yeah.
while the utopian socialists just had these pretty sketches.
Exactly. They might have shared the goal of a more equitable society, but Marx believed his approach was more grounded in reality.
Okay, so he was all about the practicalities of change, not just the ideals. It sounds like Marx was really good at weaving together ideas from different schools of thought.
Absolutely. Think of Marx's thought as a three-legged stool. You got German philosophy, French political thought, and English economics.
Okay, let's break that down. I'm guessing the German philosophy part is where Hegel comes in.
Right, you got it.
All that dialectic stuff can be pretty mind-bending.
It can be. But Hegel's idea, dialectics, that history progresses through a clash of opposing forces, that was huge for Marx. And then from the French Revolution, he took the lesson that radical change, even revolution, is not only possible, but sometimes necessary. And finally, the English Industrial Revolution, well, that gave him a front row seat to the inner workings of capitalism, both its power and its problems.
So he's like a chef, taking these different ingredients and creating his own, unique flavor.
Exactly, a unique flavor.
But wasn't his personal life, kind of a mess? I vaguely remember reading about financial struggles, family drama. Didn't he have, a complicated personal life?
Oh, yeah. Marx's life was as dramatic as the revolutions he wrote about, censorship, exile, money troubles. I mean, the guy went through it all.
Sounds intense.
But, it's a good reminder, even these brilliant thinkers, they're human beings, They have real-life struggles just like the rest of us.
It kind of makes them more relatable, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a closer look then at the man behind the manifesto. What kind of person was Karl Marx?
Well, before he was the bearded, cigar-chomping, revolutionary icon that we all know and love, he was, believe it or not, a bit of a romantic.
Really?
He was a poet in his youth. He fell head over heels for Jenny von Westphalen. She was a woman from a higher social class.
Okay.
And they had a passionate love affair. But, it wasn't always easy. It was tumultuous, but full of love. It's like something out of a period drama, but with, more economic theory thrown in.
Wait, a higher social class? That doesn't really scream champion of the proletariat, does it?
It's true. Marx came from a relatively privileged background. I mean, his father was a lawyer, and his family had connections to some pretty wealthy industrialists.
Okay, so that's kind of ironic.
Very ironic. The guy who critiques capitalism, had ties to the capitalist elite.
That's almost too perfect. It's like something out of one of his books.
But despite his family's, their connections, Marx lived a life of almost constant financial struggle. I mean, he was always in debt, always relying on financial support from Engels.
So even he couldn't escape the realities of the economic system he was critiquing.
It's a good point. Personal circumstances, right? They don't always align perfectly with ideological beliefs. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's a reminder that he was human, just like the rest of us.
Okay.
What about his Jewish heritage? How did that play into his worldview?
It's complicated.
Okay.
His family converted to Christianity when he was young.
Okay.
And it was likely due to social pressure and, the anti-Semitism that was rampant in Prussia at the time.
So it wasn't really a choice, more like a necessity.
Right.
Yeah.
But some scholars argue that his Jewish background contributed to his sense of being an outsider,
Okay.
and to his critique of established power structures.
That makes sense. If you're constantly being told you don't belong, you're going to start questioning the rules of the game.
Exactly.
Yeah. So even though he wasn't practicing Judaism, that experience of being different, of being marginalized, it might have shaped how he saw the world.
Exactly. It just goes to show you personal experiences, even those from childhood, can really influence, our intellectual development. And understanding that about Marx, it can actually help us understand his theories in a deeper way. It adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It humanizes him in a way. It makes his ideas seem less abstract and more connected to like real life experiences.
Exactly.
This is all incredibly fascinating. We've covered so much ground already, from the nuances of Marxist thought to the ups and downs of Marx's own life. But there's so much more to unpack. We'll be back after a short break to dive even deeper into the heart of Marx's ideas.
Stay tuned. So we've been talking about Marx the man, right? His life, his loves, his struggles. But now let's get into Marx the thinker. How his ideas can actually help you analyze global politics. Pretty handy for that UPSC international relations paper.
Right, because I'm betting some of our listeners are thinking, okay, this is all interesting background, but how does any of this help me understand, like, the conflict in Ukraine or the rise of China? The stuff that's actually on the exam.
That's where the real meat of Marxist theory comes in.
Okay, hit me with it.
One of his most fundamental concepts is this thing called historical materialism.
Historical materialism, okay.
Mm.
I've definitely seen that term on past UPSC papers. It sounds kind of intimidating, if I'm being honest.
It's actually simpler than it sounds.
Okay, good.
Historical materialism basically says that economics is the driving force of history.
Okay.
The way a society produces and distributes goods, its economic system, it shapes everything else.
So you're saying, like, the economic system is the base.
Exactly.
And everything else, the politics, the culture, even the ideas, that's all built on top of that base.
You got it.
Okay. I can see how that would be relevant for understanding how countries interact with each other.
Right, because for Marx, the most important economic relationship was between those who own the means of production, the factories, the land, the resources.
The haves.
Right, and those who have to sell their labor to survive.
The have-nots.
Exactly. The classic class struggle. And Marx believed this inherent conflict between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class,
Okay.
and the proletariat, the working class, is what drives historical change.
So are you saying that all those global power struggles we see on the news every night, they're not just about political differences?
Right.
It's also about economic competition.
Exactly. Marx would argue that capitalism, by its very nature, is expansionist.
Okay.
It needs new markets, new sources of cheap labor, new resources to exploit, and that drive for expansion leads to imperialism, colonialism, and ultimately, conflicts between nations.
So when we see, for example, tensions between China and the U.S. over trade or resources, there's a Marxist interpretation lurking beneath the surface.
You could definitely analyze it through that lens.
Interesting. So Marx is giving us a framework for understanding the economic forces driving global politics. What other tools did he give us?
Well, building on that idea of economics as the foundation, we have the concept of base and superstructure.
Okay, you mentioned that earlier. Can we unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the base is the economic foundation of society,
Okay.
the means and relations of production. The superstructure is everything else built on top of that.
Okay.
The political institutions, the laws, the culture, the ideas, even things like religion and art.
So the base is like the engine of a car,
Okay.
and the superstructure is the car itself.
Exactly. Change the engine, and you change how the car runs.
I like that analogy. So Marx is saying that the superstructure often serves to justify and maintain the economic base.
Right, even if that base is inherently unequal or exploitative.
Interesting. So give me an example of how this plays out in international relations.
Well, you could argue that the concept of national interest in foreign policy
Okay.
is often shaped by the economic interests of the dominant class within a nation.
So a Marxist would say that if a country's foreign policy seems aggressive or exploitative, it's because that policy benefits the economic elite in that country.
They might argue that, yeah.
Wow, this is giving me a whole new way to think about things. It's like looking for the economic subtext in every international event.
And that brings us to another key Marxist concept, false consciousness.
False consciousness, okay. This one sounds especially relevant today.
It is. In today's world, with information overload, social media manipulation,
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Marx believed that the dominant ideas in a society, they often reflect the interests of the ruling class.
Okay.
And these ideas, what he called ideology, can take many forms, from promoting consumerism
Okay.
to emphasizing individualism and competition over collective action.
So it's like we're being tricked into believing things that ultimately benefit our oppressors.
In a way, yes. Marx argued that false consciousness prevents people from seeing the true nature of their exploitation
Okay.
and from uniting to challenge the system that keeps them down.
It sounds kind of depressing, to be honest. Like, if everyone's caught in this web of false consciousness, how can anything ever change?
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
But Marx believed that by raising awareness, by exposing the mechanics of exploitation, people could break free from false consciousness and achieve true class consciousness.
So it's about waking people up to the reality of their situation.
Exactly. Think about how social movements, like the global fight for climate justice, are often framed as a struggle against corporate greed and the influence of powerful economic interests.
Right. It's about connecting the dots between the economic system and the problems we face.
Exactly. And in international relations, Marx would argue that many conflicts and divisions between nations are fueled by false consciousness.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Think about how nationalism and religious differences are often used to pit people against each other,
Right.
even when they share common economic interests. It's like a distraction, keeping people focused on the wrong things while the real power play happens behind the curtain.
So it's about seeing through the propaganda, understanding the deeper economic motives behind conflicts, recognizing those shared interests that transcend national boundaries.
Exactly. And for the UPSC, it's not about agreeing with Marx entirely, It's about using his ideas as analytical tools to dissect complex situations.
So we can use the concept of false consciousness to analyze how media narratives shape public opinion about international conflicts, or how certain economic policies are presented as being in the national interest,
Exactly.
even if they mainly benefit a small elite. It's about thinking critically.
Precisely.
Wow, this is all incredibly insightful. It's like Marx is giving us X-ray vision to see through the layers of power and propaganda in global politics. Already starting to see the world differently.
That's the power of a good theoretical framework.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It helps you ask different questions, connect seemingly unrelated dots, and ultimately, develop a deeper understanding of how the world works.
Well said.
This has been fantastic. But before we wrap up this deep dive, let's explore how Marx's legacy continues to shape international relations today. And maybe even try to answer that big question. What would Marx think of the 21st century world? Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on this wild ride through the world of Karl Marx. Honestly, my brain is doing a little dialectical dance right now.
It is a lot to take in, but that's the beauty of engaging with a thinker like Marx, right? He challenges us to see the world differently, to question those assumptions we all have, and to dig beneath the surface.
Yeah, no kidding. We've covered some serious ground, from his personal struggles, his intellectual influences, to those big, meaty concepts like historical materialism, base and superstructure, and false consciousness. And what's amazing to me is how relevant these ideas still feel today, even though he was writing way back in the 19th century. It's like he had a crystal ball or something.
Right. And in fact, I'd say his analysis of capitalism is even more relevant now in the 21st century. Think about it. Globalization, the insane concentration of wealth, in the hands of a tiny elite, the growing gap between rich and poor. I mean, these are all trends that Marx predicted.
It's kind of eerie, like we're living in a world that Marx in many ways anticipated, but of course, things aren't exactly the same as they were back then.
Of course not, no. The world's always changing. I mean, Marx couldn't have foreseen things like the rise of the welfare state, the growth of the middle class, or the crazy technological advancements we've seen. I mean, the internet alone would probably blow his mind.
So if we could somehow teleport Marx into the 21st century, what do you think he'd make of it all? Would he be like, see, I told you so? Or would he be totally surprised by how things have turned out?
I think it would be a mix of both.
A mix?
Yeah, I mean, he'd probably be, smugly satisfied by some things, like the persistence of economic inequality despite all our technological progress.
Right.
He might point to the 2008 financial crisis or the rise of the gig economy as evidence that capitalism is inherently unstable, prone to crises.
I can totally picture him writing a fiery blog post about, like, The exploitation of gig workers or the obscene wealth of tech CEOs.
Oh, absolutely. But I think he'd also be surprised by some things.
Like what?
The sheer scale and complexity of global capitalism today, I mean, it would probably be mind-boggling, even for him. And he might be surprised by the ways in which workers have organized and fought for their rights, leading to improvements in working conditions, social safety nets in many parts of the world.
So it's a mixed bag. Some things are playing out as he predicted, while others have taken unexpected turns.
Exactly. And that's why studying Marx is so valuable, especially for, UPSC folks. It's not about blindly accepting everything he said as gospel truth. It's about using his ideas as tools to analyze and understand the world around us.
It's about developing that critical thinking muscle, right? That ability to see beyond the surface and question the assumptions that kind of underpin the systems we live in.
Exactly.
And that skill, my friends, is pure gold, not just for acing the UPSC exam, but for navigating life in general. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Karl Marx, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the most important thing is this. Marx was, at his core, a critic of power and inequality. He believed in a more just and equitable world. And he gave us some really powerful tools to analyze and critique the systems that, perpetuate injustice.
He was like an intellectual revolutionary, shaking things up, forcing people to see the world from a different perspective. And whether you agree with his proposed solutions or not, his diagnosis of the problem, it remains remarkably relevant.
Absolutely. So to all our UPSC aspirants out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a solid grasp of Marxist thought and, how it can be applied to the study of international relations. Remember, knowledge is power, and being able to analyze global events through different lenses, well, that's a superpower, especially for that international relations paper.
And for those of you who aren't prepping for the UPSC, we hope this deep dive has piqued your curiosity about the enduring relevance of Marx's ideas. Because let's face it, in a world grappling with economic inequality, climate change, political polarization, we need all the intellectual tools we can get to understand the challenges we face and to imagine a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.
And hey, while you're at it, hit that like button and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more mind-expanding adventures in the world of ideas. Until next time, happy diving.